A new world, a new life, wealth, freedom, and opportunity. That's what was promised to those who dared the 2-month journey across the Atlantic to settle the new world. These ambitious dreamers will go on to establish 13 colonies and form a nation that will attract those from all corners of the globe. But establishing this new nation will not be an easy feat, and the colonists will find themselves against adversities such as famine, disease, and eventually war against the world's most powerful military. A war whose outcome will change the world forever. This is the story of the American Revolution, explained with video games. The year is 1492, and a middle-aged Italian man with wild hopes, dreams, and ambitions is about to embark on an expedition that, if successful, will establish a brand new trade route between Europe and Asia. However, rather than arriving in Asia, this man will find a 42.5 million square kilometer landmass standing in his way. We all know this landmass today as the Americas, which is split into 2 continents, North and South America. Although often credited with discovering this new world, Christopher Columbus was not the first European to reach the Americas. This feat was accomplished nearly 500 years earlier by the Norse explorer Leif Erikson in 1000 AD. After Columbus's discovery, England, Spain, France, and the Dutch Republic all launched major colonization programs in North America. But this was easier said than done. To the dismay of these European powers, settlements would not be easy to establish, and many of the early attempts would end in failure. One of the most famous examples is the colony of Roanoke, whose inhabitants mysteriously disappeared shortly after the colony was founded. The colonists themselves faced high rates of death due to disease, starvation, inefficient resupplies of necessary goods, conflict with Native Americans, attacks by rival European powers, and more. From a colonist perspective, the New World was a rather hostile place, but they would not be dissuaded. Spain would become the first to successfully establish a permanent settlement with the founding of St. Augustine in what is now Florida in the year 1565. The British Empire would later follow suit with its first permanent settlement, Jamestown, in 1607, which would mark the founding of the first British colony, Virginia. The establishment of new colonies would continue until 1733, when the city of Savannah is founded and Georgia becomes the final British colony. These 13 colonies are Virginia, New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Maryland, Rhode Island, Delaware, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Prior to the Revolution, life in the colonies was actually pretty good. The colonists were incredibly prolific, and the colonies were ripe with economic opportunity. Politically, the colonial governments shared a lot of similarities. Battlefield.org writes, "Nearly all of the colonies held royal charters with Parliament or the British monarch. Each colony had a royal governor appointed by the king. This individual held ultimate say over the decisions in the colony. However, most colonies also had colonial assemblies, bodies of elected officials who conducted local affairs and business. For much of the 18th century, this relationship was at peace with one another. Colonists enjoyed the full wealth and protection of the British government, including the British Army and Navy. However, there was still very little unification between the colonies, as they all operated independently from one another. Escalations between the colonies and the British monarchy didn't begin until shortly after the ending of the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War in 1763. This war was incredibly destructive and bloody. Some historians have even referred to it as the true First World War. Despite the British victory, the war resulted in massive debt for the empire, and British Parliament felt the colonies should be taxed to help foot some of the bill.
Low taxes, oh.
This led to laws such as the Stamp Act, which was passed in 1765. This act marked the first internal tax to be levied upon the 13 colonies by the British government. This law placed a tax on all paper documents in the colonies, including wills, deeds, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards. Up until this point, the government of each colony was responsible for the imposition and collection of taxes. The colonists were heavily opposed to this new tax, and as a result, riots and protests broke out throughout the colonies. Laws such as the Stamp Act and Sugar Act would give rise to the famous rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." They believed it was unconstitutional for British Parliament to tax them, as the colonies had no representation in the British government. Due to its unpopularity, within a year, the British government repealed the Stamp Act. However, this small victory would only fuel the colonists' confidence in opposing future taxes. A year after the Stamp Act was repealed, the Townshend Acts would be passed in 1767. This was another attempt by Parliament to raise revenue and assert its authority over the colonies. You see, the Townshend Acts imposed taxes on specific goods imported to the colonies from Britain. These goods included glass, lead, china, paint, paper, and tea. In response, the colonists boycotted the goods and began rioting, protesting, and harassing British customs commissioners. But rather than give in to the colonists, Britain decided to send 2,000 troops into Boston to try and quell the unrest. Considering Boston had a population of only about 16,000 at this time, this would equate to 1 British soldier for every 8 Bostonians. As you might guess, sending troops to occupy Boston only made matters worse. History.com writes, skirmishes between Patriot colonists and British soldiers, as well as colonists loyal to the British Crown, became increasingly common. To protest taxes, Patriots often vandalized stores selling British goods and intimidated store merchants and their customers. These tensions would come to a head on March 5, 1770, when a street brawl between American colonists and British soldiers got out of hand, resulting in the 7 soldiers firing into a crowd of 200 colonists, killing 5 of them. This event would infamously go on to be known as the Boston Massacre. Although the colonists were technically the aggressors as they began throwing things at the soldiers before any shooting commenced, Paul Revere would distribute a famous engraving depicting the British as the aggressors. This would help fan the flames of revolution even more. Shortly after this event, Britain would withdraw her troops from Boston and repeal much of the Townshend legislation. This resulted in the removal of all Townshend taxes except the tax on tea, and in 1773 the Tea Act would be passed. The purpose of this law was to help bail out the declining East India Company, which was an integral part of Britain's economy. This law essentially gave the East India Company a monopoly on the importation and sale of tea in the 13 colonies. Unsurprisingly, the colonists were once again dissatisfied with the new law and responded accordingly. From History.com, the Sons of Liberty, a radical group, decided to confront the British head-on. Thinly disguised as Mohawks, they boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and destroyed more than 92,000 pounds of British tea by dumping it into the harbor. To make the point that they were rebels rather than vandals, they avoided harming any of the crew or damaging the ships themselves, and the next day even replaced a padlock that had been broken. We know this event today as the Boston Tea Party. The British government was not happy about this little stunt, and they decided these rebellious colonists needed to be put in their place. In the spring of 1774, Parliament would pass the Coercive Acts as a response to the Tea Party. In the colonies, these acts were often referred to as the Intolerable Acts. This collection of acts closed Boston Harbor, replaced Massachusetts' elected council with one appointed by the British, gave comprehensive power to the British military governor, General Thomas Gage, and forbade town meetings without approval. From a colonist perspective, these acts probably seemed pretty unfair. But there was one part of these acts that stood out and infuriated the colonists more than any of the other laws: the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act required colonists to house and quarter British troops whenever necessary. This included housing them in their private homes. This meant the colonists had to house and feed British soldiers at their own personal expense. Parliament passed these acts hoping that New England would be cut off from the other colonies, thus preventing unified resistance against British rule. Instead, the other colonies arose to Boston's aid, sending supplies and setting up their own state governments to discuss British misrule. State governments is in quotes, as they were technically called provincial governments during this time, but they're technically the same thing. In September 1774, the First Continental Congress meets in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. You can think of the Continental Congress as the federal government of the 13 colonies. For the first Congress, every colony except Georgia sends elected delegates. Facing a war with Native American tribes, Georgia did not want to risk losing British assistance. This group of delegates includes some familiar names such as John Adams, Samuel Adams, George Washington, and Patrick Henry. Their purpose? To show a combined authority against the British. However, not all colonies were on the same page. For example, Pennsylvania and New York sought resolution with Britain, while other colonies wanted full-on separation. The first Congress essentially ends with the colonies deciding to continue resisting the British unless the coercive acts, aka the intolerable acts, were rescinded. Moving forward to April 1775, we find ourselves just before the first official battle of the Revolution, Lexington and Concord. Faced with the threat of full-on colonial rebellion, Thomas Gage, the appointed Royal British Governor of Massachusetts and the drafter of the Coercive Acts, orders the seizure of American weapons and powder being stored in Concord, Massachusetts. However, American spies discovered Gage's plan. On the night of April 18th, Paul Revere and others ride out and raise the alarm that the British were coming.
Know that the regulars marched for Lexington and Concord.
The British are coming!
Although he never actually said the British are coming. The whole purpose of the mission was to be as discreet as possible. Plus, he wouldn't have used the term British as many colonial Americans still considered themselves British. On April 19th at 5 o'clock in the morning, 700 British troops march into the small town of Lexington. But they're met with resistance. A ragtag group of 77 militiamen, also known as Minutemen, led by Captain John Parker, stand in their way. A British major yells, "Throw down your arms, ye villains, ye rebels!" Yet, despite being heavily outnumbered, the rebels stand their ground, facing down the world's most powerful military. At some point during this standoff, Parker orders his men to disperse, when suddenly a shot rings out. Although no one knows who fired the first bullet, this shot heard round the world marks the first shot of the war. The American Revolution has officially begun. After this first shot is fired, the British begin firing upon Parker and his company, who then begin retreating. As they fall back, 8 rebels are killed and 9 are wounded. On the flip side, only 1 redcoat is injured. After this short skirmish, the British continued on towards Concord to complete their mission. When they arrive, they find that the vast majority of weapons and gunpowder had already been relocated, so they decide to burn what little they could find. Now outside of the city, about 400 militiamen from Concord and surrounding towns begin to gather on the high ground overlooking the city. When they see smoke rising out of Concord, they wrongly assume that the British are torching the entire town. This causes the rebels to make an advance on the city, specifically the North Bridge, which was being guarded by about 220 redcoats. The British respond by firing, which kills multiple rebels. The rebels then return fire. This kills 3 British soldiers and wounds 9 others. At this point, the redcoats retreat into the city. This battle is technically where the famous term, "shot heard round the world," actually comes from, not the previous skirmish at Lexington. After this attack, the British are ordered to fall back to Boston, which is 18 miles away. By this point, nearly 2,000 Minutemen had descended upon the area, with more following closely behind. This fresh wave of patriots begin following the retreating British. As the redcoats march back towards Boston, they come under fire from rebels hiding along the road, as well as the rebels following behind them. They fire at them from behind trees, stone walls, houses, and sheds. These ambushes continue relentlessly for the next 12 miles until the British reach the safety of Boston. The first battle of the Revolution is an American victory. The news of this battle spread rapidly. It announced to the world that the colonies could hold their own and they were ready and willing to fight and die for their freedom. On June 16, 1775, the Americans learned that the British are planning to send troops from Boston to occupy the hills that surrounded the city. In response, nearly 1,000 colonial militiamen, commanded by William Prescott, are sent to defend one of these hills in Charlestown, known as Bunker Hill. However, they decide to march past Bunker Hill and defend Breed's Hill instead, as it was closer to the city. The battle became known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, due to people confusing which hill the battle was actually fought on. Once the marching British were within several dozen yards of the militiamen, the Americans opened fire upon the Redcoats, causing the British to retreat. History.com writes, after reforming their lines, the British attacked again, with much the same result. Prescott's men were now low on ammunition though, and when the Redcoats went up the hill for a third time, they reached the redoubts and engaged the Americans in hand-to-hand combat. The outnumbered Americans were forced to retreat. However, by the end of the engagement, the casualties of the Battle of Bunker Hill were high. Patriot gunfire had cut down some 1,000 enemy troops, with more than 200 killed and more than 800 wounded. More than 100 Americans perished, while more than 300 others were wounded. Although this was technically a British victory, Britain suffered much higher losses compared to the Americans. This battle would help to further convince the colonies that they could stand up to the might of the British military. 3 weeks later, on July 2nd, 1775, George Washington arrives just outside of Boston in Cambridge to take command of the Continental Army. Despite his arrival, the siege of Boston turns into a stalemate for a number of months as the Americans lacked the necessary firepower to overtake the city. Moving away from Boston and forward 6 months, the Revolutionary War still resembles a civil war rather than a war of independence, since many colonists were still reluctant to the idea of total independence from Britain. Thomas Paine's publication of Common Sense in January of 1776 helps to change this mindset. His 47-page pamphlet sells more than 100,000 copies within a few months. This is an absolutely staggering amount for the time period. In his pamphlet, he presents ideas such as forming a government whose purpose was to serve the people, total eradication of the monarchy, establishing a nation based on self-rule, and creating a strong central government with a constitution that protected individual rights. Common Sense would help pave the way for the Declaration of Independence. Around this time, the French and Spanish began sending supplies to the colonies to help aid them in their fight against their common enemy, the British. Going back to Boston, the Americans have finally acquired themselves the necessary armaments to take the city. These 50-plus cannons were captured by the Green Mountain Boys under the command of Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, with relative ease at the British-controlled Fort Ticonderoga, which is located about 158 miles northwest of Boston. These weapons arrived in Boston in late January 1776. On March 2nd, Washington's army begins bombarding the city. The Continental Army obtained a major advantage during this siege by placing the cannons atop the hills surrounding the city. The British realize this and decide they cannot defend the city against Washington's forces. So on March 17th, 1776, the British troops evacuate the city and sail to Nova Scotia, ending the 8-year British occupation of Boston. Boston is now back in the hands of the colonies. Alright, let's take a brief break from the north and head down south. After their defeat in Boston, the British decided to move on to their next strategy, establishing a foothold in the southern colonies and rallying loyalist support. Loyalists were those who were still loyal to Britain. Battlefields.org writes, such claims of widespread loyalists eager to join the fight were put forth by royal governors in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. The now British Commander-in-Chief Sir William Howe sent his second-in-command, Sir Henry Clinton, with a detachment of troops to secure these claims and aid in the unfolding campaign of 1776. To commence this campaign, the city of Charleston was chosen after Commodore Sir Peter Parker, no not Spider-Man, discovered a flaw in the fortifications guarding the harbor to Charleston, the richest port city in North America at the time. He discovered that the fort that lay upon Sullivans Island, which guarded Charleston Harbor, was only half completed. Parker insisted that the city's defenses were no match for the Royal Navy, and with that, the British were off to try and take the city. Unfortunately for the British, they underestimate the city's defenses. One of the key features of the fort is that it was made of palmetto trees. These trees are much spongier and more flexible than other trees, meaning they could absorb more impact from cannon fire. To add to this, Charleston Harbor was difficult to navigate, even for experienced sailors, as there were many places for ships to run aground. So when the British attacked from the sea with their navy, they found their cannonballs had little effect on the palmetto-constructed fortifications, while other British vessels became grounded while trying to flank the fortifications. Eventually, the British gave up and withdrew. The battle resulted in 220 British casualties versus 37 American casualties. The Patriot victory helped increase support for independence among South Carolina's population, and the British defeat would see the war's focus turned away from the South for the next several years. A couple of weeks before this battle occurred, a 5-man committee including Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin were tasked with drafting a formal document to Britain regarding the colony's intentions. We know this document today as the American Declaration of Independence. Written mostly by Thomas Jefferson, the purpose of the Declaration of Independence was to announce to the world the colony's intent to form their own independent nation. History.com writes, as Jefferson drafted it, the Declaration of Independence was divided into 5 sections, including an introduction, a preamble, a body divided into 2 sections, and a conclusion. In general terms, the introduction effectively stated that seeking independence from Britain had become necessary for the colonies, while the body of the document outlined a list of grievances against the British Crown. The preamble includes its most famous passage. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Obviously, the great hypocrisy with the line, all men are created equal, is that at the time, these rights did not fully apply to you if you were black, Native American, or a woman. Keep in mind, the word men at the time was a gender-neutral term. However, in an early version of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson did include a 168-word passage that condemned the evils of slavery. He essentially labels slavery as a crime against humanity that was forced upon the colonies by the British government. Although I don't agree that it was forced upon them, as there were plenty of wealthy colonists who were more than happy to own slaves, including many of the founding fathers. The Continental Congress decided to remove this passage from the final draft. Why did they remove it? History.com explains, the removal was mostly fueled by political and economic expediencies. While the 13 colonies were already deeply divided on the issue of slavery, both the South and the North had financial stakes in perpetuating it. Southern plantations, a key engine of the colonial economy, needed free labor to produce tobacco, cotton, and other cash crops for export back to Europe. Northern shipping merchants, who also played a role in that economy, remained dependent on the triangle trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas that included the traffic in enslaved Africans. Despite this, many African-descended people still participated in the revolution on the Patriots' side. It's estimated that between 5,000 and 8,000 African-descended people fought, bled, and died for America's independence. On July 4th, after a couple of days of editing, the Continental Congress officially adopts the Declaration, and the United States of America is born, although it wouldn't actually be signed until August 2nd. A copy would later be sent to King George, who basically ignores it, leaving the colonists on red. The Declaration of Independence will go on to become a significant landmark in the history of democracy, not only for the United States, but the entire world. Moving on, let's revisit our good friend General George Washington. After the successful recapturing of Boston, Washington takes his men and heads to New York City. However, things are about to take a turn for the worse for his army. Starting in August of 1776, British forces begin seriously kicking some American butt, pushing the Continental Army south out of New York. In November, the British successfully capture Fort Washington in Manhattan and take 2,000 Americans prisoner. Pursued by the Redcoats, General Washington retreats with his army across New Jersey and eventually across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, where they make camp. By December, things were looking pretty grim for the Continental Army. They were lacking in food, ammunition, supplies, and morale. Plus, a harsh winter was upon them, making the situation even more miserable. Washington realizes that if action isn't taken, his army will be doomed and the war lost. So he plans a bold attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. Hessians were German soldiers who served as auxiliaries to the British Army during the American Revolution. The purpose of this attack was to help bolster morale within the Continental Army and encourage more men to join the ranks. The plan originally involved a three-pronged attack, but due to a severe winter storm, two of the columns are forced to turn back, leaving Washington's column on its own. Despite this, Washington pushes on and crosses the icy Delaware River. They reach Trenton on December 26th. Washington decides to split his force into two columns. One will attack from the north while the other attacks from the south. Although the Hessian garrison receives warnings of rebel movements, the Hessians are exhausted and unprepared for Washington's attack. To add to this, no one really expected an attack from the dwindling Continental Army in the winter. This allowed Washington's forces to take the garrison by surprise and capture the majority of Hessians with relative ease. But they weren't out of the woods yet. Washington realizes that they cannot hold Trenton against the reported 8,000 British reinforcements led by General Cornwallis on their way from Princeton. So they retreat back across the Delaware River. A few days later, he decides to cross again back into New Jersey with an army of 2,000 men. In order to bolster his troop numbers, Washington convinces militiamen whose terms had expired to stay on for 6 more weeks. This ups his forces to 5,000 men. Eventually, Washington's force of 5,000 comes face to face with Cornwallis's force of 5,500, somewhere between Trenton and Princeton. The two sides fight until night when Cornwallis pulls back for the day, assuming he has Washington trapped. Using the cover of darkness, Washington secretly moves his force past the British, arriving in Princeton the next morning. I imagine Cornwallis was quite surprised when he awoke to find the opposing army had disappeared. Upon reaching Princeton, a battle ensues and Washington's forces capture the small college town. But they do not stay long. A few days later, the Continental Army will move and arrive in Morristown, New Jersey to set up camp for the winter. On June 14, 1777, the Continental Congress passes a resolution stating, "The flag of the United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, and that the Union be 13 stars, white in a blue field, representing a new constellation. The United States flag is born." Moving forward to mid-September of 1777, we arrive at what many historians claim to be the turning point of the war, the Battle of Saratoga. In an attempt to cut off and isolate the New England colonies from the rest, the British come up with a plan to take upstate New York and control the Hudson River. The plan involved having 3 separate armies meet near Albany, New York, which would establish British dominance throughout the state. General John Burgoyne would come down from Canada, arriving from the north, Colonel Barry Ledger would arrive from the west, and General William Howe would march from the south. On his way down, Burgoyne will recapture Fort Ticonderoga for the British. By mid-September, his force of about 7,500 men reaches the northern outskirts of the small town of Saratoga. Opposing him is the American General Horatio Gates with a force of about 9,000 men. The other 2 British armies will never meet up with Burgoyne. General Howe instead heads to Philadelphia, where he defeats Washington and captures the city. This forces Congress to flee to Baltimore, Maryland. The Battle of Saratoga is split into 2 parts. Part 1 of the battle took place on September 19th at Freeman's Farm. History.com writes, "Momentum changed sides several times, but neither side gained significant ground until Burgoyne ordered his column of German troops to support the faltering British line and forced the Americans to pull back. Still, the British suffered twice the number of casualties than the Americans and couldn't continue their drive to Albany. After this battle, Burgoyne decides to wait for reinforcements from New York City. During this time, the Americans continued to build up their forces, swelling to nearly 13,000 troops. By October 7th, no reinforcements had arrived for Burgoyne, and he decides that he must attack again. MountVernon.org writes, "This time, the American forces held against the British assault and were able to counterattack to regain any lost ground. Burgoyne and his troops, defeated, began a march to the town of Saratoga, where they entrenched themselves once again in hopes of escaping. Within a fortnight, however, Gates' army had surrounded them and forced them to surrender." Benedict Arnold also played a major role in securing an American victory during both battles. Most notably, he defied Gates' orders in the second battle, leading an assault against the British line, which threw them into disarray, which contributed greatly to the American triumph. However, Gates, who held great contempt for Arnold, downplayed his contributions and claimed most of the credit for himself. After the battle, Horatio Gates achieves widespread public support. So much so that he attempts to run a campaign in which he would replace George Washington as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, but he fails. The outcome of this battle helps to persuade the French to recognize American independence and to openly provide military assistance to the United Colonies. On February 6, 1778, France will officially join the war as an ally of the United States. France is also the first nation to officially recognize America's independence. Which is kind of funny, considering the outcome of the American Revolution will help to inspire the French Revolution, which will overthrow the French monarchy. By now, both Burgoyne and Howe have been removed from the war, leaving Henry Clinton in charge of the war on the British side. Following the loss of Philadelphia, Washington and his 11,000 troops make camp for the 1777 to 1778 winter at Valley Forge. They arrive on December 19, 1777, suffering from cold, hunger, fatigue, and low morale. Battlefields.org explains, the Army's supply of basic necessities like food and clothing ran perpetually short. Coupled with the wintertime cold and the diseases that ran rampant through the camp, this lack of provisions created the infamously miserable conditions at Valley Forge. Many soldiers were even lacking in basic clothing such as shoes and coats. These awful conditions would lead to the tragic, painful death of 2,000 soldiers. In February of 1778, a man by the name of Baron Frederick von Steuben arrives at Valley Forge. Von Steuben is a former Prussian military officer and considered one of the brightest military minds in Europe. Washington appoints him as the temporary inspector general of the army. History.com writes, in his role, von Steuben set standards for camp layout, sanitation, and conduct. For instance, he demanded that latrines be placed facing downhill on the opposite side of the camp as the kitchens. More importantly, he became the Continental Army's chief drill master. Von Steuben, who spoke little English, ran the troops through a gamut of intense Prussian-style drills. He taught them to efficiently load, fire and reload weapons, charge with bayonets, and march in compact columns of 4 instead of miles-long single-file lines. Because of von Steuben's work, the Continental Army emerges from the winter at Valley Forge as a well-trained, confident fighting force. After France enters the war, General Clinton is forced to evacuate his troops in Philadelphia on June 18, 1778, and move them to New York City. This allows the Americans to recapture Philadelphia. George Washington and his army rejoin the fight at the Battle of Mammoth in New Jersey in late June. In July and August, the French and American forces have their first joint military operation when they besiege Newport, Rhode Island. In December, the British besiege Savannah, Georgia, and capture the city. On June 21, 1779, Spain officially enters the war when it declares war on Britain. The Spanish largely helped by assisting in the Midwest and Gulf Coast. In September and October of 1779, the Americans and French attempted to recapture Savannah, but fail. Moving on to 1780. In May, the British attempt to capture Charleston, South Carolina, and succeed. In September, Benedict Arnold conspires with the British to surrender the fort at West Point, New York, a fort that he was in command of. This makes Arnold a traitor to the Americans. Mr. Arnold felt that his accomplishments and efforts in the war thus far had gone unnoticed and unappreciated. However, the plot was discovered, forcing Arnold to flee and take sanctuary with the British. Benedict Arnold would go on to lead British campaigns in Virginia and Connecticut. By this point, many in the British Parliament were beginning to become quite upset that the war was still dragging on, and Britain's debt continued to skyrocket upwards. Part of the problem was the efforts in the Northern Theater weren't making any progress, so the British switched gears and began putting more focus on the South. As mentioned earlier, the British currently controlled Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. Things weren't looking too great for the southern colonies. After the British captured Charleston, General Cornwallis sent Major Patrick Ferguson to North Carolina to recruit members to fight for the Loyalist militia, as well as squash any patriots he met along the way. At first, Ferguson made short work of the numerous but uncoordinated rebel militia bands east of the Blue Ridge Mountains. However, when he attempted to move further west, he severely upset a backcountry militia known as the Over Mountain Men. These two forces meet at Kings Mountain, South Carolina on October 7, 1780. History.com explains, the two forces, 900 Americans commanded by Colonel Isaac Shelby and others, and 1,105 under Ferguson on the British side, met on a rocky hilltop in western South Carolina. The Americans attacked Ferguson's position from all sides, shooting Ferguson off his horse and killing him, and his force surrendered after suffering heavy casualties. Oh boy, was this a lopsided battle. The Americans only obtained 90 casualties, while the British racked up 1,018 casualties. Up until this battle, the British saw the southern colonies as the soft underbelly of the United States. The outcome completely disrupted Cornwallis's plans in the South and essentially turned the tide of the war in the Southern theater. On October 14th, George Washington appoints General Nathaniel Greene as the commander of the Southern Continental Army. Moving ahead to January 17th of 1781, we come to the Battle of Cowpens. Cornwallis was attempting to advance into North Carolina to gain more territory for the British. In response, General Greene split his forces in two, so Cornwallis would be forced to fight on two fronts. One of these two forces was placed under the command of General Daniel Morgan. This force numbered about 1,000 troops. Morgan was sent to attack the British Fort 96. To counter Greene, Cornwallis sends Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton with a force of 1,150 troops to block Morgan's progress. Tarleton had a brutal reputation for allowing his forces to slaughter Americans that tried to surrender. These two commanders met at a location named the Cowpens. It earned this name for being a well-known enclosed pasturing field for cows. History.com writes, Tarleton chased Morgan's forces but didn't have good intelligence about how many men the Americans had, a disadvantage that proved critical. The two sides confronted one another at Cowpens, a pasture near Thickety Creek. In a crafty move, Morgan organized a line of his men to fire a couple of volleys and then retreat, creating the illusion that the Americans were fleeing in panic. When Tarleton's forces chased them, they ran into a withering barrage of gunfire from another line of American riflemen that Morgan had hidden, followed by a cavalry attack led by William Washington, a distant cousin of George Washington. By the end of the battle, the Americans had suffered 149 casualties, while the British suffered 868 casualties. The British defeat at Cowpens forces Cornwallis to give up his efforts to win South Carolina. So instead, he pursues Greene's force into North Carolina. Greene and Cornwallis fight at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March. The battle resulted in a British victory with heavy casualties for both sides. However, at this point, Cornwallis's army is so depleted and exhausted that he returns to Virginia to rest and re-equip his soldiers. This creates an opportunity for George Washington to trap him, setting up the Battle of Yorktown. By now, the war has dragged on for nearly 6 years. Both the British and Continental armies are exhausted. Britain now holds very little territory in America and is still waging war with France and Spain over in Europe. The American conflict was becoming increasingly unpopular on both sides. At this point, both the United States and Britain wanted a quick resolution to the war. In the spring of 1781, General Washington has to make a choice. He can either attempt to take back New York City or look to the south and attack Cornwallis in Yorktown, Virginia. He picks Yorktown as the French assured him naval support for the battle. However, Washington does set up bait camps near New York City in order to trick the British into thinking they were going to attack New York instead. Battlefields.org writes, in the fall of 1781, the British occupy Yorktown, where Cornwallis intends to refit and resupply his 9,000-man army. While he awaits supplies and much-needed reinforcements from the Royal Navy, the Continental Army seizes an opportunity. On receiving word that the French fleet will be available for a siege south in New Jersey, Washington and Rochambeau move their force of almost 8,000 men south to Virginia, planning to join and lead about 12,000 other militia, French troops, and Continental troops in a siege of Yorktown. By mid-September, Washington arrives in Williamsburg, Virginia, just 13 miles away from Yorktown. In order to bolster the city's defenses, Cornwallis has 10 small forts built with artillery batteries and connecting trenches. To counter this, Washington's men dig trenches about 800 yards parallel to the British. Once completed, they begin a week-long artillery assault on the city's defenses on October 9th. At some point, the British Navy does attempt to reinforce Cornwallis, but the French fleet is guarding the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. A naval battle ensues that ends with the British Navy retreating. After the first artillery barrage, which knocks out most of the British heavy guns, Washington orders his troops to dig a second parallel trench 400 yards closer than the previous on October 11th. However, in order to fully complete this new trench line, forts number 9 and 10 need to be captured by the Americans. The French lead the attack on fort number 9, while Colonel Alexander Hamilton leads the attack on fort number 10. On the night of October 14th, the Americans fire flare-like shells into the air that illuminate the sky. The final attack is on. History.com writes, "At that point, Hamilton and his men rallied from their trenches and sprinted across a quarter-mile of field with fixed bayonets. For the sake of silence, surprise, and soldierly pride, they had unloaded their guns to take the position with bayonets alone. Dodging heavy fire, they let out war whoops that startle their enemies. Hamilton loses only 9 men in this attack." The final attack results in Cornwallis and his forces becoming trapped against the river. On October 16th, Cornwallis attempts to make a nighttime sea evacuation but is stopped by a storm. On October 19th, having no other options, Cornwallis sends a drummer boy followed by an officer waving a white handkerchief. Cornwallis has surrendered. The battle ended with 8,589 British casualties compared to 389 American casualties. After the American victory at Yorktown, the war is essentially over in the American theater. Naval battles will continue in Europe between Britain, France, and Spain until September 3rd, 1783, when the signing of the Treaty of Paris officially ends the war. After the treaty is signed, Britain removes the last of her troops from US soil. The American Revolution is over. The outcome of this war sends shockwaves throughout the world. The age of modern democracy has begun. In the end, nearly 17,000 Americans gave their lives for freedom. And through means of war, the United States stands as the first and only nation to win independence from the largest and most powerful empire in history. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already done so.